The year is 1823, and we find ourselves in the German town of Tübingen. Two young students climb the spiral staircase of a medieval tower. At the top of the stairs, they find a half-open door leading into a tower room. They know who is inside, and this knowledge fills them with awe and excited anticipation. The first student hesitates to cross the threshold, but the second plucks up his courage and knocks on the open door before entering the room. Inside, they find an unkempt, bearded man sitting at the window, staring spellbound and with glassy eyes at the river flowing past his tower. It is the mentally impaired poet Friedrich Hölderlin. He has been living in this tower room for 16 years at this point. In 1807, he was taken in by a good-natured carpenter after spending several terrible months in a clinic for the mentally ill. Since 1803 at the latest, he had not been well and was showing increasing signs of a mental breakdown. His family and friends did not know what to do with him, and in the end, he was abandoned by everyone. And so he ended up in this terrible institution, before a carpenter named Zimmer, who was an admirer of his work, took pity on him. What had happened? What had led to this mental breakdown? And who exactly was this strange madman in the tower?
Hello, dear viewer. I am the Hapless Romantic, and today I want to talk about one of my all-time favorites, Friedrich Hölderlin, with whom I share a very special bond. Hölderlin was a poet, one of the greatest, in my humble opinion. But as is so often the case, he was misunderstood by his contemporaries and is still not one of the big names that everyone has heard of, at least once.
He was born in 1770. When he was only 2 years old, he lost his father, and when he was 9, he lost his stepfather. And no doubt, this early loss of 2 father figures was of great importance for his development. He grew up with his mother, as well as a sister and a half-brother. And it was his mother who held great power over him all his life.
He held a very difficult relationship with his mother, because on the one hand, he always wanted to please her, but on the other hand, she always wanted him to become a priest, and she would constantly urge him to finally settle down and take a respectable position as a priest somewhere, rather than be a drifter who wrote poems that nobody wanted to read.
But Hölderlin had other ideas, and so he was always torn between the very dominant figure of his mother and his personal dreams and ambitions.
What made the whole thing even worse was that despite the fact that he tried to stand on his own feet and earn his living, it was never very much, and so reluctantly he was recurrently dependent on his mother's goodwill, because despite the fact that his father had bequeathed him some money, and it must have been quite a handsome amount, his mother denied him this rightful inheritance. And I can only describe this circumstance as very tragic indeed. Because if Hölderlin would have had the money he inherited from his father at his disposal, the course and destination of his life could have been quite different. All Hölderlin ever wanted was to pursue his poetic ambitions, unimpeded by the stifling demands of everyday existence. And with that money, he probably, quite comfortably, could have done just that. He could have pursued his dream much more freely, without the constant worries about his livelihood and his future. He would not have been compelled to hire himself out as a tutor and work for people that treated him disrespectfully. He would not have been forced to degrade himself time and time again. Everyday existence was his greatest enemy, just as it is mine. And his constant worries and incessant battles against the harsh circumstances that he faced contributed greatly to his eventual breakdown. So not only did his mother deprive us of all the great works that Hölderlin was unable to write because he didn't have the necessary time and peace of mind, but she also unwittingly contributed to the mental illness of her son. And all because she wanted to coerce him into a respectable social position by becoming a priest.
According to his mother's wishes, he studied theology at the seminary in Tübingen. 5 long years he studied there and suffered under the poor living condition and the restrictive regulations of that institution. The best thing to come out of that time was his friendship with 2 fellow students who would go on to become 2 of the most prominent philosophers of German idealism, Friedrich Schelling and Georg Wilhelm Hegel.
For everyone who is not familiar with the term, German idealism was a very important, influential movement in the history of European philosophy. This was truly an extraordinary meeting of brilliant minds, and for too long Hölderlin's role in this trio was underestimated, because, as a matter of fact, these 3 men inspired each other, and it was precisely in these early years that Hölderlin exerted a vital influence on both Schelling and Hegel. For Hölderlin was not only a poet, but also an intellectual, and a deep thinker, and a gifted philosopher and theorist. And in fact, he also studied philosophy as well as theology at the seminary.
In 1793 he finished his studies, and in 1794 he got a position as a private tutor for the son of Charlotte von Kalb, a friend of Friedrich Schiller. In fact, it was Schiller who recommended Hölderlin. Schiller was already an eminent, well-respected poet and playwright at that time, and Hölderlin deeply admired him.
Schiller was something of a mentor figure for him, and it would take Hölderlin quite a long time to creatively step out of Schiller's shadow and stop imitating him and find his own authentic voice as a poet. And a little side note about Hölderlin's job as a private tutor. Back then, it was common practice for children, primarily sons, of well-to-do parents to be educated at home and not at school. And in fact, many famous people started out as tutors, just like Hölderlin. His friend Hegel, for example, also worked as a private tutor for the first few years after his graduation and before he was able to launch his academic career. And if you have read Charlotte Bronte's novel Jane Eyre, you have the same thing there. In this case, it's a female governess who tutors the ward of an English aristocrat, but it's the same principle. So Hölderlin didn't do anything unusual, but acted very much in accordance with the social norms and practices of his time, actually. But of course, being a private tutor for hire wasn't a very prestigious position, and you were usually looked down on by your employer. At any rate, Hölderlin would stay with the von Kalbs only for a few months, because he couldn't handle the bad habits of his pupil.
For a while he stayed in the town of Jena, close to his idol Friedrich Schiller. But apart from Schiller, there was another reason why he chose Jena. For it was at that time that the famous philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte lectured at the university there, and Hölderlin was very fascinated by him and his philosophy, just like his friends Schelling and Hegel and the whole rest of the German intelligentsia in those days. Hölderlin was hoping to settle in Jena and establish himself there, but it was not meant to be. In 1796 he found a new position as tutor, this time for the son of Jakob Gontard, who was a rich banker living in Frankfurt.
And this is where the great love story of Hölderlin's life took place.
Not long after his arrival, he fell utterly in love with Suzette, Gontard's wife, and he had the great fortune that she was as besotted with him as he was with her.
This whole love story deserves a video of its own, which is why I will not go into any more detail just now, even though it pains my heart to do so because it is such a lovely story, but you will have to watch my video for that. Suffice it to say that Hölderlin and Suzette kept up a secret relationship for well over 2 years, right under her husband's nose. And Suzette even became the inspiration for one of his most important recurring female characters, Diotima, or Diotima, as she is sometimes pronounced. Diotima, or Diotima, features most prominently in the only novel that Hölderlin ever wrote. It's called Hyperion, or Hyperion, which is also among his best-known works. And once again, Hyperion is such a rich subject matter that it too deserves its own separate video. Eventually, her husband got wind of the affair, and after what must have been quite a heated altercation between the two men, Hölderlin hastily left the Gontard's house. In the following 4 years, between 1798 and 1802, Hölderlin tried his luck with 2 more tutoring positions and kept meeting Suzette in secret whenever possible. The last meeting took place in May 1800. By 1801, he already was more or less a broken man. All of his plans to establish himself on the literary scene had failed. His hopes of becoming a lecturer in Greek literature at the University of Jena, as well as his ambition of founding his own literary journal, had come to nothing. Only a handful of his poems had been published. His novel Hyperion did get published, but went mostly unnoticed. And many works that he had set out to write stayed fragmentary and unfinished. But despite all of that, he never stopped writing poetry. Poetry seems to have been like a lifeline for him. It was his chosen medium to deal with the blows that life dealt him. Poetry and his beloved ancient Greece were his mental refuge. And in the end, he would totally lose himself in this inner world of his. The first signs of this mental collapse appeared during his time in Bordeaux, where for the last time he held yet another position as tutor. But Hölderlin only stayed there for a few months, before quite suddenly and inexplicably returning to Germany. It's not clear what happened, only that he left Bordeaux in May 1802 and then travelled for about 3 months, quite aimlessly it seems, with sojourns at Paris and Strasbourg, only to finally arrive in his hometown of Nürtingen in June. Family and friends who encountered him were shocked by the state he was in. Apparently, he had given up on himself. He no longer cared about his appearance. He had grown a long beard. He didn't tend to his clothes. He had long, dirty fingernails and could hardly utter any coherent sentences. It seemed like somewhere on the road, during his wild wanderings, he had lost his mind. And apart from his inherent sensitive nature and the shattering of all his dreams and the nerve-wracking hardships he must have endured during his long travels on foot, and there is evidence that somewhere on the road between Bordeaux and Germany he might have been attacked and mugged. Apart from all that, there's one more incident that commonly gets cited as one of the main reasons for his breakdown. And that is the death of Suzette, his great love. Suzette died in June of that year, so right around the time of Hölderlin's wanderings. It is not known when or how exactly he learned of her death. But it is significant that this devastating news found him at a point where he was at his most fragile. Nobody knows what it was that finally pushed him over the edge. But when he returned from that long, arduous journey and learned of Suzette's death, he was never the same again. From that point on, his condition would alternate between calm, lucid states and violent, agitated fits. For a while he would continue living with his mother, which probably only contributed to making his condition even worse, given the difficult nature of their relationship. For months he locked himself in his room and became a virtual recluse. One of his last few friends managed to get him a position as court librarian for the Landgrave of Hessen-Homburg. But this was just for show. In reality, it was nothing more than an honorary title, and Hölderlin never really worked as a librarian. Finally, in 1806, he was admitted to a mental hospital, against his will. The whole ordeal must have been quite traumatizing for him, because he was more or less abducted and thrown into a carriage by several brute men. And apparently he tried to fight back and even tried to jump out of the carriage at one point. And after that came months of horrifying, cutting-edge treatments by the doctors. So if he had not been totally broken and traumatized before he entered the asylum, the efforts of the doctors made sure that he finally lost the last bit of his sanity. After several months, he was deemed incurable. And lucky for him, the aforementioned carpenter rescued him from this horrible place and gave him a new home. And so we come back to the beginning of our story. From 1807 until his death in 1803, he would remain in that tower, cared for by the carpenter and his family. Over the years, he would gain some sort of cult status, and many curious visitors would come and visit him. Some of them quite regularly, and some of them also quite famous in their own right. Like, for example, those two students that I mentioned in the beginning, who were climbing up Hölderlin's tower to visit him. They would go on to become literary figures in their own right.
They were Edward Mörike, who is quite well known in Germany for his poems, and Wilhelm Waiblinger, who is virtually forgotten today and is only known because of his short biography he wrote of Hölderlin.
It's not very accurate, but it is important because in it he shares his personal, first-hand account of Hölderlin during this time in the tower. During his time in the tower, Hölderlin developed certain mannerisms. I want to mention them here because I find them quite telling. I think that they tell you a lot about him and his condition. For example, he had gotten into the habit of addressing absolutely everyone with certain titles such as Your Highness or Your Majesty or Your Holiness. He always adopted a very submissive attitude and barricaded himself behind a wall of politeness. And I suspect that this can be seen as a protective mechanism. For me, this is a sign of a deeply disturbed, traumatized and wounded soul that has been worn down by the world and is so sore that any contact with the world, especially intimate, emotional contact with people, must cause unbearable pain. By barricading himself behind such impersonal phrases, he was able to keep the world at a distance. I see it as a survival strategy. He was very defensive and unapproachable, especially when asked questions about his life. He would never answer such questions directly, but always try to evade them. This was true whether you asked him questions about his life or his work. On the other hand, he was still very immersed in poetry, and he was still writing poetry from time to time, and he was regularly reading in his own Hyperion. But he was completely in his own world. He was lost in his poetic world, you might say. The outside world no longer concerned him. There has been repeated speculation about the extent to which Hölderlin may have simulated his illness. And I do think that it can be argued that at least to some degree it might have been a mixture. I mean, he was quite certainly seriously ill, because you just cannot simulate a mental illness so convincingly and consistently for so many years. Too much of his behavior would simply be impossible for a healthy person to imitate. And when you read the reports, it is very clear that he really had serious problems. He had problems forming clear thoughts. He could no longer follow a conversation. His thoughts kept breaking off. He became distracted very quickly, and he could not focus on a train of thought anymore. But still, I think that at least part of him consciously developed these survival strategies and defense mechanisms. The fact that he was not completely deranged, but that he knew, at least to a certain extent, what he was doing, is demonstrated by his clever use of words. There was a method in his seemingly nonsensical utterances. A good example is the word kallilusomenos, which he once used to describe himself. Kallilusomenos seems to have Greek origins and has been given several different interpretations. The most beautiful of these interpretations is he who will redeem, dissolve, or liberate himself in beauty. Now, as I said, there are various different interpretations of this word, so this may not be the accurate one. But it would suit Hölderlin very well, I think, if he had actually used this word in this sense. But apart from these few instances in which his once brilliant mind was able to shine through, he was truly and hopelessly detached from the world.
In total, Hölderlin spent 36 years in this tower. That's exactly half of his life. And throughout those 36 years, his condition never changed much. He did become calmer over time, but his mental confusion and his disjointed thoughts remained constant. And tragically, he knew it. It seems that, at least in some moments, he achieved a sad lucidity and some kind of self-awareness. This can be seen in one of his last poems, where he wrote, quite movingly, and I quote, "I am nothing, and do not care to live anymore." End quote.
Now, so far I haven't talked at all about any of his works, even though they would most definitely deserve it. And rest assured that there are lots of details about Hölderlin's life that I haven't mentioned or only hinted at very briefly. But that was intentional. It wasn't my intention to exhaust all there is to say about Hölderlin in this comparatively short and introductory video. What I am primarily concerned about in this instance is showing why I regard Hölderlin as a prime example for my melanistic romanticism and why he is of such importance to me. So on the one hand, it's about my own personal connection to Hölderlin, and on the other hand, it's about the connection to the main themes of this channel. And these two purposes interleave, because in trying to explain why Hölderlin is so dear to me, I also automatically highlight the main themes and the messages that I want to communicate to you, dear viewer, on this channel. I might do some videos in the future where I take the proper time to talk about Hölderlin's works in more detail, but for now I'm more concerned about the man. Now, why is Hölderlin of such importance to me? His fate touches me incredibly deeply. It moves me like few other things do. Why? Quite frankly and simply, because I see myself in him. Because I see him as a kindred spirit. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that there is no one to whom I feel more connected, even though, sadly, I have never met him, of course. And even though there are many other historical figures whom I also admire greatly and with whom I feel a close connection too. But none of them managed to touch me just as deeply as Hölderlin does. Although a few come very close, like Kleist, for example, and Keats and Novalis, who significantly all lived at the same time as Hölderlin. But Hölderlin is the foremost among them. He deserves the crown of my affection. I will try to explain why, and I hope that you will indulge me and bear with me, because I might get a bit rambly. Now, the first reason why I love him so much is obvious. I love and adore him because he is a very romantic figure. His tragic life is pure romanticism. Furthermore, it is melanistic to the highest degree. And if you have seen my video where I try to explain what I mean by that term, you know what I mean. And not only his life can be regarded as melanistic, but he himself too. He had a romantic, melanistic soul. And that brings me to my second point. I love him because I see so many parallels between him and myself. Hölderlin was a very sensitive soul, and I can understand him and all his struggles, his struggle with life, so well, because I am built the same way. When I hear him speak, I hear my own voice. I hear my own ideals, my own aspirations, my own pain, and my own indignation. I share his aesthetic, his poetic, and his melancholic sentiments. I share his love for beauty. I share his view that love and beauty truly are the road to salvation. And I mean not just the superficial physical forms of love and beauty, but rather the platonic kinds. I mean the beauty of the soul. True love and beauty are the things that save us because they ennoble us. They are divine concepts that ought to be revered. And I love that through his poetry, Hölderlin endeavored to build a kind of a shrine, so to speak, to love and beauty and to everything that's noble and divine, in nature as well as within the human soul. I share Hölderlin's creative and idealistic ambitions, and also his perfectionism, as well as his self-criticism and self-loathing. I also share his intention to poeticize life in a way. That's basically the same thing that I am after. Call it poeticizing or romanticizing or mystification or idealization. It's all the same thing. It's about realizing that the world has to be transformed somehow, to be elevated. That we, with our creative and imaginative powers, have to actively shape our reality. Because the way it is, the way reality presents itself to us, is unacceptable and depressing. And I love that he was at odds with the times that he lived in. I share his aversion. I share his frustration with his circumstances and with his fellow human beings. We are both enamored by the past and see in bygone eras a greatness that is absent today. For him, it was ancient Greece. For me, it's Hölderlin's time, mostly, the Romantic period, as well as other periods to some extent too. And it's quite funny how Hölderlin hated his time and how I adore it. Although I must say, I adore it mainly for aesthetic reasons. I mean, I'm not saying that the living conditions or the social system or that people back then were any better. Quite the contrary. Of course not. But let's not go too deeply into exactly why I love the aesthetics of the Romantic period so much. That's a topic for another time. But in connection with this historical escapism and being dissatisfied with the reality one lives in, I also share Hölderlin's deep-rooted, one might even say pathological, sense of longing. He acutely felt the desacralization of the natural world and the self-imposed isolation of modern man through the materialistic worldview. And in contrast, he strive to overcome this existential impasse by mystifying life and creating a kind of spiritual haven through the means of poetry and art. And one reason why he loved the Greek gods so much, for example, is because for him they were personifications of the divine forces that govern our life. Like in nature, for example. He saw nature as divine and destiny and all the forces that make up our life, that are important in our life, that shape our life. And I too long for that haven. And I too feel the abysmal discrepancy between the real and the ideal. I share his feeling that the world as such, but especially the modern world, is insufficient, is fundamentally lacking, is frustrating, and is a pale imitation of the paradise that we carry within ourselves. And I can also relate to how torn he was between withdrawing from the world, wanting to flee and to escape, and at the same time longing for community and companionship and being one with everyone and being one with everything, being torn between intimacy and aloofness. I know how it feels when you want to belong, to be one with the other, with the collective, with creation itself. But at the same time, you are deeply insecure. You are frustrated and bitter. You are hurt. Your soul is sore. Your heart is battered and bruised. Humans, it seems, are unable to give you what you are looking for. They are unable to fulfill your needs. You want to stay true to yourself and to your ideals. But this makes you incredibly lonely. You long for company and for communion, but not just with anyone. You look for the right kind of company. You look for the company of souls who understand you, of course, and who share your feelings and your ideals. But these kinds of sensitive souls are incredibly rare, which makes it extra hard. And so you move in an eternal cycle of hope and disappointment, from which it seems you cannot escape. And the worst thing is, even you yourself cannot live up to your own ideals. And you believe that you must prove your worth in order to be accepted and welcomed and valued and loved, which is why you are incredibly hard on yourself, placing exaggerated demands and expectations on yourself that you can never live up to, which is also why you develop an increasingly intense self-hatred until you curse yourself as well as others. And in the end, you curse life itself, the whole of existence, which is a incredibly terrible place to be in. But I know this place. And Hölderlin, I think, knew it too. So when I see Hölderlin, I see myself.
I see a tender soul. I see someone who carries within him an inner sacred fire, which he wanted to give to the world in a poetic way. Like a young boy who, in complete innocence, develops a childlike enthusiasm and joyfully wants to express this enthusiasm and share it with others, but who is rejected by the world, who, instead of love, open arms, and shared enthusiasm, receives a beating, whose sacred enthusiasm and joy are deeply hurt and wounded, and who, as a consequence, withdraws into himself and is no longer happy with his life, because he feels that he cannot share with the world this sacred fire, this enthusiasm, this beauty and harmony, and this need he carries within himself.
It feels like water is poured on his torch, so to speak, whilst the others continue celebrating their wretched and debased revelries, which he finds distasteful anyway. He remains in the shadows, left entirely to his own devices. All he has is his inner fire, which he tries to use to warm himself in his lonely state. He courageously continues to fight, continues trying to win people over. But after repeated failures and countless disappointments, he breaks down. Or rather, he is completely consumed by his fire and is no longer of any use to the outside world. He is permanently enraptured. So I always see this little innocent boy in Hölderlin, and also in myself. This little innocent boy who starts out with this soulful glimmer in his eyes. But the more time goes by, the dimmer and duller it gets. I see a soul that only wanted to bring beauty to the world, that only wanted to make the world brighter, that only wanted to enrich it with its light. But the world wanted nothing to do with it. It destroyed it, quite maliciously and foolishly. It maliciously and foolishly extinguished its flame. No one wanted his gift, and no one wanted him, because those who do not want his fire also do not want him as a person, because these two are identical. His fate moves me not just because it is deeply personal for me, because I feel like him, but also because for me it is exemplary of how the world treats souls like him. It is deeply tragic. But as Hermann Hesse, the famous German novelist, reminds us, Hölderlin can also be regarded as a heroic figure. Let me read you a quote from Hesse.
His fate is above all a heroic fate, and these are supra-individual. And that is precisely why we so often see great gifted people perish in the face of obstacles that the little man can easily overcome. And it is easy for the healthy average mind to declare the gifted to be psychopaths. Certainly, some of those heroes are also psychopaths. But far beyond that, they are heroes. They embody venerable and dangerous attempts by humanity to ennoble itself, and their fate is steeped in a heroic, tragic atmosphere. Hölderlin was destined to portray this tragic fate of the gifted in a monumental way. The tragedy that flows with no less force in Schiller's life, for example, has found an incredibly clear and incredibly moving expression in Hölderlin.
Friedrich Hölderlin, the mad poet in the high ivory tower of idealism, with his hat in the clouds, sitting among the gods on Mount Olympus, looking down upon the world, towering above it all. By his fellow human beings he was perceived as mad, as the lowest of the low. They had no use for him. They didn't know what to make of him. They always disregard their greatest. He was almost forgotten. And even today they don't really know what to make of him, how to neatly categorize him and his works. But I know a fellow romantic soul when I encounter one. Even though he was enamored with the classics, and even though it was ancient Greece where he felt at home, it matters not. What matters are his sentiments, his ideals, and his disposition. Hölderlin was the personification of a romantic stargazer who finds no foothold in this reality, but who, nevertheless, serves as a role model in his being as well as his creative efforts. He expresses a truth and a beauty that, despite his tragic failure, must represent an ideal and something sacred for all similarly inclined romantics. And with these words I say, good night out there, whoever, whatever, and wherever you may be. Bye-bye.